Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Jessica Hanser, an associate professor of history at the University of British Columbia, to talk about her book, Mr. Smith Goes to China: 3 Scots in the Making of Britain's Global Empire. Dr. Hanser, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So your book, Mr. Smith Goes to China, 3 Scots in the Making of Britain's Global Empire. I want to start with the first part of that title, Mr. Smith Goes to China, because you're actually not talking about one person. You're talking about 3 Mr. Smiths. So can you just tell people, who are these people and how do their stories tell us something about Britain's global empire?
Sure. Well, so I came across this George Smith when I was doing research as a grad student at the British Library. I was reading East India Company papers, China factory records, and this George Smith keeps popping up over and over again. And he's causing all sorts of trouble. And so I don't know, for some reason, it was just like I couldn't stop seeing George Smith. And for a long time, I thought, well, it's just one person, as you might naturally think. And I remember then I came across 2. I realized, oh, there's a second one. It can't just be one George Smith. There's actually 2. And I was like, okay, I think I've got a handle on this. There are 2. And I remember one night I was at home after researching. I was sitting in my kind of, student flat in London watching Channel 4 or something on TV. And I got this really kind of sick feeling like, there may even be a third one. And actually, I think I might be mixing them up. And I had that sort of feeling like a pit in my stomach, and then a kind of a cold sweat, like, oh no, this whole project isn't gonna work. But over time, I sort of worked out who was who. It involved, paleography. So looking at the signatures, the S looks different on one Smith, the G is different on one George, figuring out who was where when, based on they wrote a letter and said they were in Madras, but then 3 months later it says they're in Canton. Is this the same person? How long did it take to sail from one port to another on a sail ship in the 18th century? So it was a lot of there were a lot of sort of sleepless nights and sort of moments of self-doubt and fear, I think, which is sort of natural when you're embarking on a kind of a new archivally based research project with people with the same names. So that's sort of how it came about. What's kind of interesting is that in my dissertation, there are only 2 George Smiths, but actually in the book, there are 3, because it took me so many years to work out who was who. And so yeah, they ended up, they were all Scottish. In the beginning, I didn't even realize that they were all Scottish. So that was something that developed. Only one of them left a will, and the other 2 did not, which I believe is because they both were insolvent. They had gone bankrupt, so they didn't actually have much property to leave. But one, George Smith, ends up fairly wealthy and has a lot of money to leave. So he was a bit easier in some ways, although he left less of a paper trail than the other 2, George Smith of Madras. So I distinguish them by the sort of the port that they are most associated with, in the 18th century when they're sort of doing their work. And so there's George Smith of Madras, George Smith of Canton, and George Smith of Bombay. And that's something that even people at the time used to kind of distinguish them, because, even for people then, it's like, oh, which guy are we talking about? And George Smith, of course, is such a common name, Smith being the most common last name. in the period for an English person. And George, I looked up, I believe is about the 6th most common first name at the time. And of course, in the 18th century, that is the century of Georges. I mean, because you've got King George the First, Second, and Third, and of course there's a fourth. And but that's the 18th century is a kind of a, I mean, we talk about the Georgian era actually, right? So yeah, so that's the sort of the 3 George Smiths, and yes, Scottish, a bit hard to research. And part of what makes them hard to research, besides the fact of the common name, is the fact that they were private traders. And what that means is they weren't working for the East India Company. Now, if you were sort of anybody at the time, you know, out in Asia and India and China trading in the 18th century, you were most likely working for the company, because the company had a deal with the British government that only company people could be trading in Asia, basically east of the Cape of Good Hope, east of Africa. So most people who were out, you know, in the Indian Ocean world were company people. But these private traders were people who either cut a deal somehow with the company to get permission to go, or they just went without permission. And so they're sort of known as interlopers by the company for being out there illegally. Yeah, so they're hard to research because, you know, their own sort of papers don't necessarily survive. Oftentimes, you know, these individual merchants, their papers just disappear. And so I found them actually through their interaction with the East India Company. So the East India Company kept amazing records, and those records have survived. So that's where you find sort of snippets of them, and particularly when they're causing trouble, because usually in history, when things are going smoothly, you don't know about them. It's when something goes awry, someone's causing trouble, that they sort of surface in records. And so that's how I kind of honed in on them, because they were basically pissing off the East India Company for various reasons. And the company was writing about them. And then I followed up with everything I could think of, newspapers, you know, I mean, you know, the sort of digitization of archival materials has gotten better. Actually, as the project is developed, I was able to find them in all sorts of sort of niche locations. But yeah, so I mean, even Chinese records, actually, one of my George Smiths is named in a Chinese archive. Why they are important, what they mean for the British Empire, that's the sort of big thing. The argument that I'm making in the book is that when we just focus on the East India Company, I mean, if you tell people, oh, I work on Britain and China, I work on the East India Company, everybody knows, you know, okay, East India Company, I've heard of that. They did something.
We've all seen Pirates of the Caribbean. You know.
Yeah. We know East India Company, we know tea. Maybe people have heard about opium, you know, and the Opium War, perhaps. But these people were really kind of, because they're hard to research, they're basically invisible to historians, to normal people. And I'm arguing that actually they played a disproportionate role to their numbers in sort of financing the East India Company's tea trade. They were really playing a critical role in moving money around the Indian Ocean. And, you know, it's something like modern people we take for granted. Like, I mean, actually, even a credit card, I was going to say, oh, we have credit cards. Even that's a little bit passe now. Like, oh, you know, you got your Apple Pay, or you're like, you know, pretty soon we'll just have like face recognition and you'll be paying with that. But back then, you know, to pay to buy tea, to buy some goods, you know, in Asia required silver, right? Which is not only heavy, but you know, there were some limits on transporting silver. The British government actually did not want too much silver to be sent out of the country to Asia. So finance becomes a really big problem. And so these merchants, these private traders who are not company people, fill a gap for the East India Company in terms of finance that the company itself was not able to sort of, it was a problem, a perennial problem for the company to have enough silver to buy tea. And so these people kind of fill that gap, that financial gap. Yeah.
I had one more question about this, thinking about how this connects to China's first embassy, which is something that's another critical part of your book. But just as a side tangent, I wonder if even now you kind of wake up in a cold sweat thinking, well, is there a fourth George Smith? Is there a fifth George Smith? Is that still something that haunts you?
Yes, it does, because there is a fourth, there is a fifth. There's a fourth George Smith. He's known in the records as George Smith Jr. So he's the only one who's got Jr. at the end, which indicates his father is George Smith as well. But he was a what they called a supercargo. So for people who do shipping, they know this term supercargo. For sort of the average person, maybe you haven't heard the term supercargo, but it's the person who is basically the business manager of a ship. Like they're dealing with the cargo of the ship, like the buying and selling. And so he was one of these supercargo agents of the company who was living in Canton. And so he worked for the company. So he's not a private trader. And I'm pretty sure I see a George Smith who becomes a director of the company. He moves back to London, like a few years after he's in Canton. So I'm pretty sure there's a fourth George Smith, definitely, who was actually a company person and became a director. There's like a Jorga Smith, there's like a Danish George Smith, I'm pretty sure out there, yeah. So there are a bunch of them, and one could imagine, yeah, like a book where it was one chapter per George Smith. I think, okay, people say, oh, it's clever, it's cute, but what I would say about this method in history and kind of focusing on a name, and I mean, there's something quite organic about it, because if you say, oh, okay, let me just look at what all the George Smiths right now are doing in the Indian Ocean world in the 18th century, it is a kind of natural way to kind of archivally driven way to learn about this world. Like, I'm not sort of imposing some structures or some of my own ideas. I'm just like, oh, I came across these people with the same name. What are they up to? And then that can kind of reveal, a whole world that you weren't aware of, right? So that's, yeah, I mean, that's the kind of the beauty of the microhistorical approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I do want to get to that question of microhistory in just a second, but if you could talk a little bit about Britain's first embassy. When people think of the word embassy, I don't think they're necessarily thinking of the way that you use the word. So how do these Smiths connect to China's first embassy?
Yeah, that's a good point about the word embassy, because we get used to the words, like the kind of vocabulary and the lexicon of the 18th century. And what I mean by embassy, or what they meant by embassy, is this was really the first moment when the British government had made an attempt to send diplomats to China, to open up like negotiations with the Chinese government, with the Qianlong emperor and his officials. And they were actually hoping to establish a permanent ambassador who would live in China for, like quite permanently. So why this is important? Well, it's not that Britain and China, I mean, what do we mean by the terms Britain and China is another kind of question, but yeah, there were connections between British people, Chinese people for centuries before this. But this is the moment when the British government says, this tea trade that we've got is really valuable to our national economy and our way of life. And there have been some hiccups back in Canton and in modern day Guangzhou in terms of trade. And it's so important that we really want to stabilize things. We want to make sure that the trade runs smoothly, that we have good relations with the Chinese government. So that's what's happening with this embassy. Yeah.
You've written in your book that historians have long mused over this question of the why as to why the British government, namely Henry Dundas, I think I'm pronouncing his name right,
Yeah.
abruptly turned his attention to China for potential imperial exploits. You've noted that one explanation is that private traders were influential in policy decisions pertaining to China. I want to say a quote from you here. You write, Smith of Canton requested that the ambassador of China present British creditors' claims before the Qianlong emperor. The private financial interests of 50 or so creditors nearly made it into the agenda of Britain's first embassy to China. Although the remaining Hong merchants in Canton, the rest had gone bankrupt in the financial crisis of 1779, had been ordered by the Chinese government to assume the debts of their insolvent colleagues and use a collective fund to repay British creditors in 10 annual installments. The Chinese repayment plan included only 1/10 of the amount claimed by George Smith of Canton and others. This left British creditors scrambling to recover the rest of their money. Smith of Canton hoped the British government could attain from the Chinese government full payment of the Hong merchants' debts to British creditors. He tried to convince Dundas that the debts due by the Chinese to British subjects will be extremely influential in forwarding the obtaining of a permanent and solid regulation of trade to China and putting their trade on respectable footing. That's a whole lot going on there. Can you just elaborate on that further and relate this to this question of why the British so seemingly abruptly turned their attention to China?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot going on. Just to back up, one of the things that the George Smiths do, in addition to lending money to the East India Company to finance their tea trade, is they actually also lend money to the Chinese merchants who are trading with the East India Company. And the reason they need money, they're not buying tea, they're selling tea, but they have to make purchases where they have to purchase the tea in advance from the farmers who are growing it up in, Fujian province, further north. And they have to do that a year in advance. So they're always, kind of seeking capital. And these private merchants like the George Smiths were a good source of capital. So, but the problem was that a lot of that money was loaned at pretty high interest rates, like sometimes above 20% per year. I don't have much of a head for finance, but even I know that that's not a good idea to take a loan with that much interest. So a lot of the Chinese merchants end up bankrupted by this. And so then the British have a hard time recovering their money. And so the George Smiths, they're very clever. Because on the one hand, they're writing letters to this person, Henry Dundas, who's basically like the number 2 guy in government. He's number 2 to William Pitt, the younger, who was the prime minister at the time. And so Dundas is the kind of the person back in London who, if you could say anyone was sort of overseeing the British sort of involvement in the Indian Ocean world in India and China, that's the person. So the Smiths, the two of my George Smiths, are writing extensively to Dundas, telling him, kind of, acting as like reporters, as spies. They're giving him a sense of what's going on the ground, because it's like to sail from England to India could take 6 months. So communication is very slow. Dundas has to rely on these people by letters going by ship, and they're telling him what's going on, but they're also trying to convince him of the importance of sending this embassy to China. And part of that is because they have a personal stake in this. They are owed a lot of money by Chinese merchants, and they're having a hard time getting it back. Even when they are given some of the money back, it's in these 10 annual installments that don't come with interest. Again, no head for finance here, but I'm pretty sure that if you're owed money and it's being given back to you very slowly with no interest, it's a problem, especially because these people, these George Smiths, were acting as brokers. It wasn't their personal money. They were lending on behalf of other people. So they're in trouble, because they can't get the money back. It's in some ways, some people have kind of likened it to a Ponzi scheme, a kind of like Bernie Madoff-esque situation here. So yes, they want it's in their interest to have the British government go talk to the Qianlong Emperor and put pressure on him to try to get their money back. So that's where their sort of skin in the game in all of this is. But there's other things happening at this time. One really important event is known as the Commutation Act of 1784. And this basically, so just to back up, you've got the British are trading in China, but so are the French and the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Danish and the Swedish. And but the big tea drinkers, okay, are back in England. So a lot of tea that these European companies are purchasing is going to England and it's being smuggled. And so in 1784, the British government cuts the tax on tea dramatically. It had been taxed at almost 100%, and that tax gets dropped to about 12.5%. And it means that almost the entire tea trade ends up in the hands of just the British. Like, whereas it had been sort of shared, right? You had all these different countries and their East India companies purchasing tea. 1784 is this turning point where, where Britain captures basically the tea trade, the global tea trade. And so it becomes even more lucrative for the British government. It has even more importance. So that's a really like economically, that's a sort of important event that then gets the British government particularly involved with China. And there's some interesting work that's come out, in the last few years. Paul Van Dyke is one person who's been working on this, who has shown that even though the British were like not in charge of what was going on in Canton, they basically were developed. Because they had gobbled up most of the tea trade, they had incredible market power in Canton. So, no, they're not a colonial power, but they have a lot of influence over Chinese merchants, actually, by the 1780s. So the British are really becoming deeply entangled with what's going on in Canton in that 1780s period. So it's not surprising then that actually the first embassy that had been planned was in 1787, but the ambassador died along the way. Which was not uncommon because of disease and unhealthy conditions on ships. So they try in 1787. So that's just a couple of years after that 1784 Commutation Act, and then they finally get in a mission in 1792 to go. Yeah. The other point I'll just quickly throw out that historians have made before is that. And this is for like an American audience, right? What happens, in 1783, it's like the end of the American Revolution. So also the British, they've lost the American colonies. So there is this kind of bit more of a focus eastward because, okay, well, let's think about what we've still got. We've got India, we've got parts of India, we're kind of expanding into India, and we've got this very lucrative trade with China.
So we're kind of jumping now into something that you talked about a little bit earlier, this idea of microhistory. My next question is, one aspect of your book that I appreciate is that you phrase colonialism in Asia in terms of interactions and conversations amongst the European capitalists in Asia, in Asian port cities, as well as between those European capitalists and Asian counterparts in those port cities. This is contrary to some literature which will focus instead on British maritime expansion in Asia as being a product of discourses taking place in London. You're looking at this very on the ground. In one example you provide as to why this reframing of colonialism in Asia is important, you write the financial system of Canton was, quote, built upon risky, high-interest loans to borrowers, eventually resulting in a financial crisis. Furthermore, you quote, mutually beneficial financial transactions and credit relationships quickly morphed into something different, something imperial. Cross-cultural credit quickly became colonial debt. So I have two questions here. I guess you've spoken to this a little bit, but based on the quote I've provided, can you elaborate a little further on why these financial transactions in Asia became predatory? And I guess we'll just start. We'll just start with that.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question because it kind of gets at the heart of why it's also like useful to be sort of focused, sort of decenter, kind of get outside of London, and focus on people on the ground in Asia who were doing the business. You know, why did it get predatory? Well, see, I don't think that people like the George Smiths or even necessarily East India Company officials in the 18th century had this like goal of taking over big sort of pieces of land or territory, although they end up doing that. I think that this this sort of transition from credit relationships to like colonial relationships happens kind of gradually as the sort of money is lent and then is not paid back, and then what does someone have then to as collateral or to give up because they owe money? It's land. And I mean, it's actually a pattern you see even outside of Asia, even in the Americas, with indigenous people. And sort of early colonial relationships and sort of this debt that leads to territorial empire. So it's really like a fine line between sort of commerce and empire. You can sort of see how when relations go sour, and when someone is claiming a debt and it's not being paid back, how do they get that money back? In a sort of maybe normal situation that we can imagine, oh, you would go to court, right? Or, there'd be some legal system. But what happens when this is transnational, multiple jurisdictions, and maybe the local rulers or the people sort of, in charge of the judicial system are themselves like kind of the ones who owe the money or who are certainly like not friendly to these foreign lenders, and so that can lead people to act violently, to try to use physical coercion, to use to use violence, and we can see that that happens both in India and in China with the British merchants. George Smith and some of his friends actually cut a deal with a Navy admiral. They say, look, if you send some gunboats to China, and by the way, like we talk about gunboat diplomacy, usually we're thinking about the 19th century, but this is the 18th century and this is already happening, right? That, okay, we send some gunboats, we try to intimidate the Chinese officials with our military prowess and see if we can get the money back, and in exchange the admiral was going to get a cut of 10% of whatever was collected. So so that's one way where you can really, by focusing on the ground in terms of what these merchants are doing, both the merchants, the British merchants, but also the indigenous people or native people, the local leaders, whether that's in India or China or wherever, you start to see how that transition can happen, where you go from relatively peaceful commerce to a much more violent kind of colonial type of interaction.
And then the second part of this question is, the term microhistory, at least in my experience dealing in history, tends to be sort of a malleable term in regards to like what people mean when they're referring to that. But it generally speaking, tends to get disparaged, I've noticed in the history field, as being too narrow and consequently being less practical than sort of broader thematic monographs. Do you describe your research as being microhistory? And if so, what would be your defense against some of these critiques that microhistory, it's too narrow to the point that it's basically useless?
Yeah, it's amazing the effect that the word microhistory has on historians, because they either love it or they hate it. It's sort of polarizing. You know, you've got groups of historians who's, oh, I love this, and they want to, be on panels with you and present with you and collaborate, and they just admire the work. And then you've got other people who say, what use is this? This is not generalizable. Or why are you trying to just break down, macro narratives? We need those big meta narratives, and you're just tearing them down. You're destroying things with your microhistory, and in an era of sort of anti-truth and anti-fact, you're just contributing to this chaos. I've been accused of that in a talk.
Yeah.
I kid you not, in a conference.
Wow.
Yeah, it's so emotional. I come to history actually with an anthropology degree. I think there was a part of me, maybe subconsciously, that was bringing in that, anthropology background, that sort of ethnographic, thick description kind of approach. I studied with some amazing people at Yale who did different kinds of microhistories: Keith Wrightson, Jonathan Spence, Francesca Trivolato, John Demos, Bob Harms. These were all people who had an incredible influence on my own work. So I think, maybe it was just inevitable that I was going to approach history this way. Where I think microhistory is really wonderful, there's a few things. First of all, there is something very compelling about a narrative. It's accessible and approachable to people. It's interesting to read. It's not dry. It keeps that human element, which I think is so fundamental to history and kind of maybe sets us apart from other disciplines, perhaps in the social sciences and humanities, that we're so human centric, right? And it keeps that humanness, that humanity, right, alive. But the other thing, from a more maybe social scientific perspective, because history, I think, always sort of sits somewhat beautifully and uncomfortably between humanities and social science, is that microhistory allows you to see things far beyond the person or the small thing that you are focusing on. It allows you to see structures, actually. It allows you to see when someone comes up against certain limits or certain institutions. So in some ways, yes, you get to know a lot about this individual or this ship or this town or whatever that focus is. But at the same time, you are seeing that micro level entity operating in a world that has lots of structures and rules and limits. And so it's actually illuminating something much bigger than the thing that you're studying, or the thing that appears to be the thing that you're studying. It almost reminds me of I remember when I studied sociology, and they talked about experiments, transgression experiments. How do you know what a norm is? Well, break it and you will see that norm. But otherwise, these things are invisible to us because we just accept them. But you have to find those normal exceptions, or those mistakes, or those weird events that then will just shed light on otherwise invisible kind of entities, phenomena, rules. Yeah, that would be my defense of microhistory.
I wanted to sort of conclude our conversation thinking about something that's a bit more self-serving to myself. So this question does have a bit of an ulterior motive. I'm going to be teaching a high school world history course this summer, and I'm sort of starting to put together the foundational building blocks of the syllabus. And one question that I'm grappling with is how to teach a topic as broad as world history. Because your research deals with interactions between people of varying geographic, ethnic, political, religious, and cultural backgrounds, so on and so forth, and you have that experience of dealing with sort of the globalizing Asian world, I'd like to hear your thoughts based on your experience researching and teaching on this topic. How do historians optimally teach world history? What themes, concepts, and ideas should we lend attention to, which would in turn provide a larger didactic arc that ties together a course full of discussions about societies that are situated in disparate spatial and temporal locations, and which by consequence have comparatively heterogeneous notions of how to understand and interact with the world. So in much simpler terms, how do we avoid teaching world history as a simple list of notable past civilizations that we kind of discuss in superficial bullet point terms?
Yeah. A wonderful question. I grapple with it myself because I mean, I'm also teaching, and I teach a British Empire course. I teach a history of capitalism. These are like big things. And it's a really great question. Like, how do you make these things accessible, meaningful, interesting, memorable? I guess, okay, some advice I would give you, I'm just going to throw out a lot of stuff. Maybe forget about coverage. Now that's easy for me to say because my students aren't going to be sitting for some kind of state exam, some kind of standardized test. So you are an agent who has to work within the structures that you're operating in. But if you're not super worried about coverage, then I always think you think about discovering rather than covering, like covering material. I really do think less is more, that touching on at a very superficial level a lot of topics is not as useful, I think, for students as going deep into a few things that can really come alive for them. I do think that history, I mean, actually, this is something that one of my mentors, Jonathan Spence, who just recently passed away, said, that history is really the interplay of the micro and the macro. So, trying to focus both on individual people, families, a town, something small, while also looking at that interplay with something much larger, whether it's a war or it's some kind of sociological development, whatever it is, but trying to find that connection between the small and the big with every topic that you do. And so one strategy is looking at people who move around, that they sort of naturally lend themselves to talking about something global. Then the pushback is, but the vast majority of people didn't move around. Like, what about all those people you're ignoring in all those sort of societies where there wasn't so much mobility? So then sometimes what we try to think about is maybe ideas that moved around. Maybe the people didn't travel, but maybe the food that they ate came from other places, or the things that they drank, whether it was coffee or tea or chocolate, or so maybe through the commercial world, the economic world, we can find, or maybe it's religion. Maybe there's a kind of there's one historian who has talked about like sort of like the millennial kind of idea of like, oh, when the world, after at the end of a millennium is going to, go crazy or change in some way. And that's a kind of a concept that you can see in different places, like, but at the same time. So yeah, trying to find those things that travel, if it's not the people themselves. doing something comparative, I guess, is another way of trying to sort of thinking globally. Like, let's look at the family. Let's look at, an institution and see how it compares across different places. But yeah, like it's really tricky to try to teach at this global level and keep it human, keep it grounded. But I would say that as much as you can do that, you can talk about the big things, but always find a way to connect it to your students, get them to connect to the material, whether it's through learning about the story of another person that they could relate to in some way, or something that they find interesting. Maybe they really like to eat sugar, they like candy. Well, sugar has a great global history you can talk about, right? And it connects to slavery, and it connects to empires, and it connects to democracies and state building and all kinds of bigger abstractions, right? So that would be my advice, is like, always try to bring it back to something that that the students can taste, feel, hear, smell, empathize with. Yeah.
Dr. Hanser, it was great talking to you. Once again, your book is Mr. Smith Goes to China, Three Scots in the Making of Britain's Global Empire. Thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast. Thank you so much for having me. And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or NAKOTADIFONZO.com. We'll see you in the next episode.